Shabbat Shalom. Did you catch the op-ed in the Monday's New York Times, authored by Peter Beinart? His central thesis, captured in the paper's headline, is "To save Israel, boycott the settlements." It's an argument that he directs primarily to American Jews. How has the New York Times become the paper of record not only for American society, but the paper of record when Jews want to speak to Jews about Jewish matters? Why nowadays, if we want to understand Jewish values and live them, do we go to the New York Times? Don't get me wrong, it's a good paper. I read it every day. But the New York Times is not Torah, and Peter Beinart is not Moses. He's not even a rabbi or a Jewish scholar. So I've been debating with myself all week whether even to speak on this topic. Why bring more attention to an argument that is marginal in the Jewish community? But in the end, all of us need to acknowledge the reality. The simple fact of the matter is that if it was published in the New York Times, you probably saw it or heard it, and if you didn't, you should have, and many others did. And furthermore, most of us give an implicit benefit of the doubt to the Times that if something is published there, by definition, it is an important issue. So for this chance to comment on what you may have read or will be reading about in coming days, let me make the following observations. To save Israel, boycott the settlements is an outrageous and immoral position. One, to save Israel. There's something arrogant and condescending about the argument that American Jews should save Israel from itself. I think Israel's done a pretty good job in saving itself over the last 6 decades. It's true that we American Jews have had and continue to have an important role to play. We should see ourselves as active partners in the struggle for Israel's survival and progress. This should apply not only to questions of national security, but also to domestic issues. The struggle to enhance and expand Israeli democracy, too, should be at the forefront of our attention. But the idea that we know better than the Israelis themselves what is good for Israel and what will save Israel, the notion that the question of settlements and the peace process, that American Jews have superior knowledge to and a more refined and exquisite moral sensitivity than Israeli citizens who are actually on the ground, voting, fighting, and paying the price for mistaken policies, this mindset is from an entirely different paternalistic era. You know, there are more Jews living in Israel now than in the United States. The only place in the world where the Jewish community is actually growing, and growing healthily, is in Israel. The greatest threat to Jewish survival is not actually in Israel. It's our community that is diminishing rapidly. It is American Jewry that needs to be saved. That's the reason why the Israeli government partnered with American philanthropists to create the Birthright program and to send young American Jews to Israel for a couple of weeks. Israel offers American Jews an essential vitamin that we lack here. Israel pumps Jewish peoplehood, collective Jewish existence, into our weakening and assimilating system. Israel fortifies American Jews with the vitamin of Jewish collective meaning and purpose and history and destiny. The Birthright folks thought that even 2 weeks in Israel might offer some inoculation against the disease of assimilation. Israel reminds us that at the core of Judaism, we do not speak about the individual and our maker, as religion is commonly understood in the West. Rather, Judaism is about community. Israel does have serious challenges, and we should be involved. And to be a critic is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Democracies are based on the assumption of criticism. To consider criticism betrayal or unpatriotic is to invite totalitarianism. But not all criticism is proper, right, or useful. The critics too should be criticized. Often the first people to cry foul are the critics themselves. They often protest too much, methinks. They are the ones who often so astonishingly exhibit such thin skin for ones assuming the roles of critics in chief. Israel is a thriving democracy with an increasingly first world economy. In some respects, it's a troubled democracy. All democracies are incomplete. They are all in the process of becoming. Even the most advanced democracies have trouble balancing rights and obligations, freedoms and responsibilities. As we speak, we are in the midst of an impassioned debate how to balance the New York police responsibility to ensure security with the rights of individual citizens in New York and New Jersey to worship unencumbered by police surveillance. As we speak, we are in the midst of asking whether our local stop and frisk actions are consistent with civil liberties. In many respects, Israel has exceeded even the most democratic countries of the world. Israel long ago accepted gays in the military and gave same-sex couples equal standing under the law. Tel Aviv was recently voted among the most gay-friendly cities in the world. Everyone has an opinion in Israel. It is a noisy, argumentative democracy. The recently retired head of the Supreme Court was a woman. The leader of the opposition is a woman. Achievements that have not yet occurred even in the United States. Israel has a far more comprehensive health system than we do. Israel does a far better job limiting civilian casualties in Gaza than NATO in Afghanistan. You know, in Israel, atheists are commonly voted to high office. I've met many members of Knesset over the years who have sat me down and lectured me why they do not believe in God. Can that happen here? 2, boycott. Therefore, the call to boycott Israel, even in the lame effort to distinguish between boycotting Israel within the Green Line and boycotting Israel beyond the Green Line, is troubling in and of itself. It is also hopelessly naive. How would one actually mount such a boycott? How one could limit it to products beyond the Green Line? How it would end at the Green Line and not become a boycott of Israel is an interesting thesis that's good for a master's degree program, but not a serious political proposal. But it is even worse than that. It is immoral, because it gives aid and comfort to Israel's worst enemies, those who seek to destroy the Jewish state. By using the word boycott, Beinart has crossed a red line. He has granted legitimacy to the delegitimizers of Israel. Boycott is the language of Israel's enemies. Boycott means to most people destroy Israel through international diplomacy and economic strangulation. It is an extreme position. There really are people who hate Jews and hate Israel, no matter what we say or do. We saw another example of this week in Toulouse, France. Now, I realize that when you write a book The book is published at a certain date, and when we are writing the book, we can't predict what the world will look like when we publish it. But the timing of Beinart's op-ed, which is based on his new book being published next week, is particularly devastating to his arguments. While thousands are being butchered in Syria by the Syrian dictator as the world stands by impotently, at a time when Americans should be devoting as much attention as we possibly can to ensuring a democratic Egypt, and while Iran is rapidly developing nuclear weapons, at a time when the Palestinian national movement is hopelessly divided amongst itself and has no interest or desire to engage in peace talks, now, American liberal Jews should be devoting our primary financial and political resources to boycotting democratic Israel? Are you serious? Peter Beinart wrote in his op-ed, "It's time for a counteroffensive, and that counteroffensive must begin with language." And his solution is to use the language of the BDS crowd? A crowd of cult-like extremists who spend their lives trying to persuade the world to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel? I much prefer George Orwell's view on language to Peter Beinart's. Orwell wrote, "If thought corrupts language, language also corrupts thought. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind." Orwell, by the way, was reputed to have remarked to a disputant, "You must be an intellectual. Only an intellectual could say something so stupid." 3, settlements. My problem is not with those who disagree with Israel's settlement policy. I, too, disagree with placing settlements in the heart of the West Bank or in the center of Palestinian towns. And I am appalled by the messianism and fanaticism of some of the settlers and their propensity towards violence. Beinart is right about that. But there are 2 grievous offenses in Beinart's blanket boycott all the settlements proposal. First, what he calls a settlement, any Jewish apartment beyond the 1967 borders, is not understood as such by practically every Israeli. Many so-called settlements are considered neighborhoods of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Most of the people who live beyond the Green Line live in proximity to the Green Line, and all 2-state solutions that have been discussed assume that these areas will be within the new borders of Israel proper. Why are they there in the first place? The Arabs launched a war of extermination in 1967 and lost. And they tried again in 1973 and lost. Those 67 borders were considered indefensible. That's why Israel felt it needed to launch a preemptive strike in 1967. Those borders were described by Israel's dovish foreign minister of the time, Abba Eban, as Auschwitz borders. Second, there is not one word in Beinart's piece about the role and responsibility of the Palestinians. Israeli settlements are still there because the Palestinians have still not demonstrated a politically realistic willingness for peace. And even if you were to concede that Israel has made mistakes, surely it's not Israel's fault alone that there is no peace. After all, it takes 2 to make peace. You cannot make peace only with yourself. Often people talk about how Israel should do this and Israel should do that, as if it's in Israel's power alone to shape events. As we speak, the Palestinians refuse to even negotiate with the Israeli government. I met with the Palestinian Prime Minister in January, but no Israeli Prime Minister has met with the Palestinian Prime Minister in a very long time. Most Israelis are desperate for peace. Is it that Israelis like sending their children to fight and die in wars? Surely there is some fault on the other side as well? No? Are the Palestinians' potted plants mere decoration as the Jews argue amongst ourselves what we should do to entice Palestinians to do what we believe is in their national interest? Maybe they don't believe it. Half of the Palestinian national movement makes no effort to hide the fact that they don't believe it. They say they want to destroy Israel. 4, one final word on liberalism. I am a liberal. I worry about liberals. Some in our camp have become so unhinged from reality when it comes to Israel. I'm worried about Reform rabbis too. And I'm worried about our rabbinical students who represent the future leadership of much of American Jewry. It is fashionable in some liberal quarters today to bash Israel as the latest litmus test of liberalism. We see it on campuses as well. And those of you who are coming from campuses and those of you who are soon going to campuses, stand your ground. We'll let you into the club, they say, but show us your anti-Israel credentials first. It's actually the opposite. Israel is the ultimate test of liberalism, the testing grounds of theory and practice. Can we develop a liberalism that relates to the world as it is, not as we would want it to be? Do we offer a compelling vision of the future or just stale liberation theories? Are we prepared to make hard moral choices, or shall we be satisfied with easy moralizing slogans? In our new world, where democracies engage insurgents who hide among civilian populations and use them as shields, when terrorists store weapons in and fire from hospitals, houses of worship, ambulances, and universities, can we develop a liberalism that fights injustice justly? That is the question. Peter Beinart was once at the vanguard of this school of liberalism that is so desperately needed today. But observing his dash to the extremes of liberal theory over the last decade, I worry about us. If in less than a decade, Peter Beinart moved from hawkish liberalism to calling for a boycott of Israelis, what does that portend for so many others in our camp? And what does that say about the future of liberalism in the United States and in the Jewish community? I'm reminded of the poem of Natan Alterman, one of Israel's greatest poets, who was troubled by our propensity towards self-criticism that blinds us to the reality and undermines our self-confidence. Then Satan said, "How can I subdue him? For he has the courage and the ability, the weapons, the resourcefulness, and the wisdom." And he said, "I will not weaken him, nor curb nor bridle him, nor inspire fear in him, nor soften him as in days gone by. I will only do this. I will dull his mind, and he will forget that his is the just cause." Amen.